Greetings, Brookings Bio students. This is Mrs. Rydell. We're going to continue our talk about Chapter 8 with the second section of your Chapter 8-2 and look into photosynthesis. People started thinking about photosynthesis a long time ago and how plants grow. And if you think about the idea of taking a tiny little seed and planting it into the ground, and from that seed, a huge plant is going to grow. Think about an acorn that you'd plant that could grow into a tree 20, 30, 40 feet tall. Where does all that new plant stuff come from? It can't obviously be hiding inside of our seed. The seed is too small. So we're going to talk about a few people that helped us come up with our understanding about photosynthesis. The first person we're going to talk about is a Belgian physician, a doctor, approximately 1600s, and his name was Jan van Helmont, Jan, notice it's spelled Jan, but pronounced Jan van Helmont, and he decided he was going to do a little experiment to see how this whole plant the seed and where does the plant come from. And so he looked at, he actually planted a seed. He took a plant seed and he measured it. How much did it weigh? And he measured the pot and he measured the dirt that he put in the pot. So he knew how much they weighed. And he was pretty diligent about this. He kept track of this experiment for 5 years. And what he did was water the plant. And every time he watered the plant, he weighed the water he was putting on. So he's keeping track of all the masses. And at the end of 5 years, what he discovered was that the seedling had gained about 75 kilograms. So it went from that tiny seed to a big plant. But when he weighed the dirt that was left in the pot, the soil hadn't really changed very much at all. He'd expected that the plant was taking things out of the soil and the soil mass would go down, but it didn't. It was about the same. It hadn't really changed very much. And so he came to the conclusion that where all that stuff to make the new plant had come from had obviously had to have been in the water, because that was really the only thing that he had been adding to the plant all this time. And he was correct in part of his conclusion. The plants do need water to grow, and the plant was taking in water, but it was also taking in something that he couldn't see. He didn't realize that the majority of the mass of his tree was not coming from the water, but it was coming from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Plants not only take in water through their roots, they take in an invisible gas, carbon dioxide, out of the atmosphere, and plants use that carbon dioxide in the water to make carbohydrates. Remember, carbs, food, glucose is a carbohydrate. Look at that name, carbohydrate. It's actually kind of telling you what it's made out of. Carbohydrates are made from the carbon of carbon dioxide. And remember, we had that hydration word, dehydration, synthesis. Hydro has to do with water. Plants are using the water and the carbon, to make carbohydrates, to make food, sugar for themselves. The second person we're going to talk about was a minister in 1700s, late 1700s. His name was Joseph Priestley. What he did was to do a little experiment and place a candle, a burning candle, into a jar, a closed container. It's called a bell jar. Can you see the shape of the container here? It's kind of shaped like a bell. And so he put the burning candle, in the jar and sealed it up so no air could get in or out. And what he discovered was, if he did that, after a few minutes, the candle would burn out. It would go out. And that makes sense. We kind of know that what was happening there. Candles need oxygen to burn. And once the oxygen in the container gets used up, the candle would go out. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question here, and you can think about how many of you ever, as a child, maybe more recently than that, took a magnifying glass outside on a hot sunny day and tried to light something on fire. I know I did. And Joseph Priestley, I think, is kind of on that same wavelength. So he kind of twisted his experiment a little bit. What he discovered was if he placed a green plant in the container with the candle, at first the candle would use up the oxygen and go out. But if you let the container sit for a few days, he could take a magnifying glass and get the candle to light again. If you put a green plant in the container, he was able to light the candle. And what that meant was the plant was making something that the candle needed to burn. And we now know that what was being replaced by the plant was oxygen inside the container. The next experiment, notice pretty similar dates. Dutch scientist named Jan Ingenhousz. I'm not going to ask you to spell these names out of the top of your head, but you should be able to match these people with what they did. Jan Ingenhousz took Priestley's experiment one step farther. He did the same thing that Priestley did. He put the plant and the candle in the bell jar, sealed them up, but he did two setups, and he put one container with the plant and the candle in the light, and he kept one container with the plant and the candle in the dark. And what do you think happened? Obviously, leaving the plant in the light, he was able to get the candle to light again, just like Priestley. But what he discovered was the setup that got left in the dark, if the plant was in the dark, it wasn't doing photosynthesis, and that means it wasn't making oxygen. The oxygen the plant was producing was coming from doing photosynthesis, and to do that, we need light. So what he discovered was that Priestley's experiment only worked if the plant was exposed to light. Okay, so far we've kind of figured out that plants use water in this process, and they need light to make it happen. And they're taking a gas out of the atmosphere for photosynthesis. The last guy we're going to talk about is this guy. His name is Melvin Calvin. And notice the dates on this. This is a lot more recent, in the 1960s. He was an American chemist, and he received the Nobel Prize for figuring out the pathway. If you look at the kind of the little diagram there, there's a lot of arrows, and remember, we use arrows to show chemical reactions. He's the guy that figured out all the steps that the plant goes through to use the sunlight and make a sugar molecule. And a lot of times in science, if you discover something new, they name it after you. So this process of using carbon dioxide to make sugar, the pathway is called the Calvin cycle. Like I said, I'm not going to ask you to come up with the names and spell them out of your head, but you should be able to excuse me, you should be able to match the people with what they did. So let's go back and talk a little bit about some ways that you can remember their names. The way I remember his name is, look at his last name, Helmont. Kind of reminds me of helmet. Think about a helmet. If you could take a helmet off and turn it upside down, it kind of looks like a pot. So I kind of remember his name that way, that Helmont was the guy with the helmet who measured the pot and the plant and the seeds and kept track of all the water. The next guy we talked about was this guy, Priestley. And look at his name. Priestley was a minister. And I kind of think of ministers, think church, think candles. He's the guy with the candle in the jar. So I kind of remember his name that way. And the next guy that we talked about was Ingenhousz. Ingenhousz, his name, I always remember house. He's got house in his name, kind of like greenhouse. And we grow plants in the greenhouse. We shine lights on them. So he's the guy with the experiment only works if you shine the light on it. And Melvin, that kind of leaves Melvin Calvin. Calvin, because he came up with the cycle, the pathway, we named it after him, Calvin cycle. We're going to talk about the Calvin cycle in a little bit. And so I remember Melvin Calvin because the pathway is actually named for him, and he's the guy that figured out the pathway. So let's talk about the big picture here. All of our experiments now kind of led us to figure out that in the presence of light, plants are going to use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water that they take up through their roots. to turn those things into carbohydrates. And in the process of this happening, plants release oxygen, goes into the atmosphere. That's where the oxygen that we breathe comes from. This is all the green plants on our planet doing photosynthesis. So we're going to write a little chemical equation. And remember, equations are kind of like story problems. We put our reactants on the left side and our products on the right-hand side. So what's going to react here is carbon dioxide and water. And we need light to make this go, so there's a little light over the arrow though. Remember, arrows mean there's a chemical reaction happening. And the products that we make in this process are going to be sugars, like glucose, and oxygen. Okay, since this is a chemical equation, let's kind of put some chemistry into this instead of words. And the chemical formula for carbon dioxide is CO2. So we're going to put CO2 underneath the words carbon dioxide. And it's going to take 6 carbon dioxide molecules to do this process. So we write a number 6 in front. Remember, when we write a chemical formula, when we put a little number next to our chemical symbol, like O2, it means 2 oxygen atoms. But when I put a number in front of that, what that means is 6 of that whole thing, 6 whole carbon dioxides. We know the chemical formula for water, H2O, so we're going to put that in our equation. H2O is water, and we're going to use 6 water molecules also, so I'm going to put a 6 in front of that one. It's going to take light to make this happen, and we're going to produce sugar. The sugar that we've been talking about, and sugar of choice, the sugar that you burn and the sugar that plants make, is glucose. So we're going to put the formula for glucose in here, C6H12O6. And notice there's no number in front. That means 1 glucose molecule. And plants give off oxygen. The chemical formula for oxygen gas in the atmosphere is O2. Oxygen is a pretty reactive atom and doesn't usually stay by itself very long. It finds another atom to combine with. So oxygen in the atmosphere, when we breathe oxygen, it's not a single oxygen atom. It's actually 2 oxygen atoms hooked together, O2. And we're going to make 6 oxygens, so I'm going to put a little 6 in front. Notice all of the reactants or products in this equation have a 6 in front of them, except for our glucose molecule. The 6 is part of the chemical formula because there's 6 carbon atoms in a glucose. And those 6 carbons that are in glucose come from the 6 C's, the 6 carbons that are in carbon dioxide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this process. Not only are plants using carbon dioxide and water, there's another important molecule that's necessary for this, and that's chlorophyll. And you can see the diagram here of chlorophyll. Remember when we talked about carbon being a really important atom because it can hook to 4 things at one time? Not all atoms can do that. And it makes it so carbon can make some really cool shapes of molecules. And look at the shape of this molecule. Lots of rings. It's got some nitrogen in there, carbons, oxygens, hydrogens. It's a pretty big molecule compared to a water molecule. And very similar in shape. That big multiple rings with the 8 rings is called a porphyrin molecule, and very similar to hemoglobin. If you look at the structure of hemoglobin, remember that's the molecule in your blood cells that carries oxygen for you. Very similar in structure to a chlorophyll molecule. Okay, the other thing we need to make this go is sun, energy from sunlight. And so all of those things now are going to be used by the plant to help them do photosynthesis, to make their own food. Photosynthesis is a pretty complicated process. It's a whole series of chemical reactions. They don't just take the carbon dioxide and water and stick them together and get a carbohydrate. It's a whole series of steps. And we're going to use one chemical reaction to make something, and then that product from the first reaction is going to be used in the next reaction, and then we make something else, and then that next product gets used in the next reaction. So it's a whole series of reactions where the product of one reaction gets used in the next step. So we're going to start with reaction 1, for example, and it's going to make some kind of a product. And then we're going to use that product in the next reaction, and we make a a new product now, and that gets used in the next reaction, and so on. It's a whole series of chemical reactions that are linked together, kind of in a step-by-step process. And when we do that, it's called a pathway. This is a biochemical pathway. So photosynthesis isn't just one chemical reaction. There's a whole series of reactions that link together to go from carbon dioxide and water till I get to my sugar molecule. And we're going to talk about those steps in our next slideshow. So right now we're going to kind of just watch a little video quick about the process of photosynthesis.
If you've ever been sunburned, you have experienced firsthand the energy of sunlight. Plants harness this energy and convert it to a form they can use by the process known as photosynthesis. The raw materials of photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water, and the products are carbohydrates and oxygen. The carbon dioxide is absorbed from the atmosphere, and the water is drawn up from the soil. The carbohydrates produced by photosynthesis are used to meet the plant's energy needs, and the oxygen produced is released into the atmosphere. Photosynthesis is a two-stage process. In the light-dependent reactions, the energy of sunlight is used to split water molecules and produce the high-energy molecules ATP and NADPH. Oxygen is produced as a byproduct of this reaction. In the carbon-fixing reactions, the ATP and NADPH that were created during the light-dependent reactions are used to convert carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. Because the second-stage reactions do not require light, they are sometimes referred to as the light-independent reactions.
Okay, so let's talk about this process. Photosynthesis is a two-stage process. First part depends on light. We need light to make that happen. The second phase of the stage of the process is called the light independent, and that means that by this point we don't need light to make it happen. This last phase is also called the Calvin cycle, and remember we talked about Melvin Calvin figuring out all the steps along the way, the pathway for how the plant is going to do this. And the first part of our light dependent reactions, we're going to use water and light, it depends on light to make it happen, to do some chemistry, and that kind of, think of that inside that box there's some reactions happening. Remember, it's a whole series of reactions to take the energy from light and put it into our energy molecules. Remember we talked about ATP and how we can save power in ATP by adding the P's. We're going to learn a new energy molecule also that helps in this process called NADPH, and we're going to talk about that in our next slideshow. But basically we're taking the energy from sunlight and turning it into chemical energy, energy stored in molecules. And that process, as it's happening, produces oxygen, which is released to the atmosphere. Now, the second stage of the process is the light independent. That means we don't need light to make this happen, and the reason is we already took the energy from light and stored it in our energy molecules, in our ATP and our NADPH. So now I can use the power stored in those molecules to run the Calvin cycle. Calvin cycle is going to take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and use it to make sugar. Notice how this is written though. We didn't write just glucose in here, C6H12O6. Remember back in our last slideshow we talked about some chemistry, and that carbs always have that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, 1 carbon for 2 hydrogens for 1 oxygen. And this process can make lots of different kinds of sugars. Remember we talked about glyceraldehyde, our little 3-carbon sugar, C3H6O3. That little N after the parentheses means that you can make sugars with lots of different numbers of carbons, but they're all going to have that 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen ratio. So we can make glucose, we can make all different kinds of sugars with the processes, but glucose is our sugar of choice. So let's connect to something else we remember from past chapters, and that's our cell parts chapter. Remember we learned about chloroplasts, the one with the little pennies stacked up inside, the thylakoids. We talked about that back in our cell parts chapter, and all this is going to be happening now. This process of photosynthesis is going to happen in the chloroplast. So chloroplasts are going to use the carbon dioxide in the water and use light energy to provide the power, and they're going to make the sugar and the oxygen for the cell. Let's backtrack a little bit and talk about waves of energy and light, because light is photosynthesis depends on light to make this happen. And we looked at this spectrum a little bit when we planted our seeds the first day, but let's take a look at, again, different sizes of energy waves. This is called the electromagnetic spectrum. And waves can vary in size from very, very huge waves. We're talking radio waves on the left-hand side here, as big as a house, huge, huge size waves, all the way down to tiny little X-rays and gamma rays that are very, very small waves, even smaller than molecules, smaller than, like, we're talking atom size. The smaller the wave, the more power it has. So X-rays are very powerful. They're so strong they can actually go through your body. That's why we can take X-ray pictures of your insides. Look in the center here, though, where it says visible light, that little yellow line. Visible light, well, the part that we can see, the waves that we can see, is a very, very small part of this electromagnetic spectrum. We can't see radio waves or microwaves, X-rays. They're invisible to our eyes, but visible light, that very, very small band, that size of wavelength there, is able to be detected by your eyes. And we're going to look a little, because that's the wavelength that plants are going to use to do photosynthesis. Remember, visible light is made of lots of different wavelengths of light. All those colors of the rainbow, each of those colors has a different size wave. And we can split visible light, what we call white light, into the different colors, rainbow colors, by shining it through a prism, or after a rainstorm you may see sunlight shining through raindrops and see that beautiful rainbow. Our eyes see different sizes of waves as different colors. So when you look at something and the wave bounces to your eye receives the signal, and then your brain interprets what size wave it is and decides, oh, that's blue, or that's purple, or that's green. So let's talk a little bit about how we see color. Most people, if you ask them why are plants green, they would say plants are green because they absorb green light, and they use green light in photosynthesis. And when they absorb the light, that's why they look green. But that is not true. That's a misconception. So let's talk a little bit about how we see. What we see is reflected light. When a light shines on an object and bounces to your eye, that's when we're going to see that object. And what's bouncing or reflecting to your eye off the object is interpreted by your brain as a color. So when white light with all the colors shines on an object, what we see as color is the waves that are reflected off the object and bounce to our eyes, and we see that as a color. So if a green wavelength bounces off an object, we see the color as green. If all of the colors are absorbed except red, we see that object as a red color. We see reflected light, not absorbed light. So when you look at a book with a blue color, there are dye molecules in that book that collect all of the wavelengths of light except blue. You're absorbing all of those wavelengths, the reds, the purples, the greens, the yellows, and everything, all those wavelengths are absorbed by the dye except blue. Blue bounces off the book and hits your eyes, and we see that book as having a blue color. We're seeing reflected light. When you look at a Bobcat t-shirt, the dye molecules that are in that t-shirt are absorbing all of the colors, all of the wavelengths, except red. And red is bouncing off of the dye in the shirt. It's reflected off the shirt and hits your eye, and we see a red shirt. If you think about black, the color black is kind of like, think black hole. When all the wavelengths shine on a black shirt, those dye molecules are absorbing all of those wavelengths of light. All the colors are absorbed. It's kind of like I said, a black hole. Everything's being pulled in, and nothing is being reflected to your eye. And we see that as black. When pigment molecule absorbs light waves. It also not only absorbs the wave, it's absorbing the energy from the wave. So when all of the wavelengths are absorbed by a black t-shirt, that's why it feels hot when you wear a black shirt in the summertime when the sun shines on it. It's because it's absorbing the energy from those waves. White objects reflect all of the wavelengths. Remember, white light is made up of all those different wavelengths, color wavelengths: red, orange, yellow, blue, green, all of the rainbow colors. So when an object looks white to you, it's because it's reflecting all of those colors to your eye. And that means very little energy is going to be absorbed by a white t-shirt, and that's why wearing white t-shirts in the summertime is cooler, feels cooler than wearing a black shirt. It's because the light is bouncing, all of the wavelengths are bouncing off the shirt, and it's absorbing very little energy. So if you look at these pictures, Mrs. Vanderwall took these from her garden. If you look at the pictures and you see flowers as colors, the reason is there are pigment molecules, different pigments in the flower that are absorbing or reflecting different wavelengths to your eye. So when you look at purple petals on a flower, they're reflecting purple light to your eye and absorbing the other colors. And when you see that little yellow center in the middle, that part of the flower has a different pigment, and it's reflecting yellow light to your eye, and we see that as a different color. Marigolds are yellow, they're reflecting yellow wavelengths to your eyes. So think about green leaves now, green plants. The reason plants are green, the leaves are reflecting green light to your eye. So green leaves look green because they reflect green light, not because they absorb green light. So the pigments that are the light-absorbing molecules that are in plants are called pigments. And so there's pigments in flowers, petals, there's pigments in leaves, there's pigments in fruit. Think apples look red, or carrots are green. There are pigments in those cells that reflect or absorb different wavelengths of light. And we have pigments in paint. When you paint in art, or think about painting your your house or your wall, you go to the paint store and they put the different pigment colors in the paint to make it look a certain color. Pigments are just molecules, any kind of a molecule that can absorb light waves. The main energy absorbing molecule, the main pigment in plants, is chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is green and it reflects green light to your eye. But there are some other pigments in plants. Think carrots, think apples. We talked about red apples or orange carrots. In the fall, we have all those beautiful fall colors. Those colors that make plants appear kind of the orangey, yellow, red family. There's a whole family of pigments called carotenoids that are found in plants as well. Look at that word carrot right at the front. That's carotenoids are those orangey, yellow, reddish pigments. And leaves, green leaves, have chlorophyll and carotenoids, and they have them all the time. There's carotenoids in leaves. We don't see it because there's such a huge amount of chlorophyll that's in the leaf that actually kind of hides those colors. And so the leaves, we see green because it's so overpowering. There's so much green compared to those other colors. Back in grade school, they used to always make pictures where you would take a piece of paper and use all your bright rainbow colors to color a cool design on the picture, oranges and reds and yellows and blues. And then you take a black crayon and color over the whole picture. Color over all the colors. And then you could take like a pencil or something sharp and kind of scratch the black off the surface, and then you see those beautiful rainbow colors underneath. And I always think of that when I think about fall leaves. Those carotenoid pigments are there in the leaves. They're there all year round. They're there all the time, but because chlorophyll, there's so much chlorophyll, it kind of overpowers it and hides those other colors, except when fall comes. When fall comes, the trees are shutting down. They're stopping photosynthesis for winter. They're getting ready to go to sleep. And the chlorophyll disappears. When the plants stop doing that photosynthesis so much, the green disappears. And then we can see all those beautiful rainbow colors, or the oranges, the reds, the yellows, those carotenoids that were there all along We just didn't see them because there was so much chlorophyll hiding them. So in the fall, the carotenoids show. They're there all year long. It's not that they just like show up in the fall and appear where they weren't. They were there all along. It's just that they're hiding by being hidden by the chlorophyll. Talk a little bit about chlorophyll. There's two kinds of chlorophyll. We call chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, and the difference is just a couple little atoms difference in that big, huge. Remember that we talked about that big ring-shaped molecule. And if you look at a graph, if I could like shine different wavelengths of light on chlorophyll and see which wavelengths it absorbs best at or which it's not so good at absorbing, I could make a little graph. And if you look at the two kinds of chlorophyll, they're very similar. They kind of overlap a little bit in the wavelengths that they absorb. But look at chlorophyll A. Look where the peaks are. That's where chlorophyll is absorbing the best. So chlorophyll A is really good. There's a peak over here in the red wavelengths. So it's really, there's a hump here, good at absorbing red. And if you look on the other side of the graph, also very good. There's a hump over in the violet area, the purples. So chlorophyll A is good at absorbing red and good at absorbing purple. Not so good at blue. If you look at the bottom here, blue is kind of low. So it's not very good at blue wavelength. And also not very good at those middle wavelengths. Look at the graph. Not very good at green at all. A little bit orange and yellow, but mostly chlorophyll A absorbs in the red and the purple range. If you look at chlorophyll B, that's the red line here. Chlorophyll B absorbs some at red, not quite as much as chlorophyll A, but it does absorb some red light. But best at absorbing in that kind of bluey purple range. The bluey and purple wavelengths of light are absorbed by chlorophyll B. So if you look at the two graphs for chlorophyll, they kind of cover that whole blue-purple range, the two kinds of chlorophyll together. They're good at red, but not so good. Neither one of the chlorophylls is very good at absorbing green light. Look where the graph is over green. It's very low. So chlorophyll is not very good at absorbing green light, and that makes sense for what we know about how we see color. If we're seeing green light, it's because seeing green leaves, it's because those leaves, the chlorophyll in the leaves, is reflecting green light to our eyes. It's not absorbing it, it's reflecting it. And that's why leaves look green. Chlorophyll doesn't absorb green light. Leaves are green, plants look green because they reflect green light to our eyes. And that's why plants have those other pigments as well, like the carotenoids. Look at the light reflecting, absorbing graph for the carotenoid pigments. They kind of do the purpley blues like chlorophyll does, but they also go a little over into the kind of that edge where the blue kind of runs into green. Carotenoids can collect some wavelengths of light that chlorophyll can't. And so we call them accessory pigments. They help absorb some of those wavelengths that chlorophyll can absorb and help the plant use more of the sun's energy to do photosynthesis. Think about this with our light experiment. Remember, we planted our plants and put them in the boxes with the different gel filters on them. Think about what that means for our experiment and which plants are going to do the best. I always have students say to me when we're putting in the boxes, and I say you're going to be red in the red box, or you're going to be in the blue box, or you're going to be, I just have kids say, oh I want to be in the green box because plants are green, they're going to like that, and I want my plant to grow the best. But think about what you know about light now. Plants don't absorb green light, and if you're not absorbing the light, you're not absorbing the energy from that light. Plants can't use green light to do photosynthesis. Okay, so red and blue violet, those purple wavelengths, the bluey wavelengths, the reds, those are going to be the ones that chlorophyll absorbs the best. And that means if you're absorbing the wave, you're absorbing the energy from the wave. Think about, we talked about the black t-shirt. If you're absorbing the wave, you're absorbing the energy. And that's what allows the plants to do photosynthesis, is using the energy from those light wavelengths that the chlorophyll absorbs and using that light energy from the wave to have the power to do photosynthesis. So when chlorophyll absorbs the light, the energy is transferred from the wave to the electrons in the chlorophyll molecule. And high energy electrons now, if you think about moving electrons, that's electricity, that's power. And once we transfer the energy to the electrons, that's what's going to provide the power to make photosynthesis work. Thanks for watching. That's the end of our slideshow. Stay tuned for our third unit in our chapter 8, 8-3, that we're going to actually look at the steps of photosynthesis and how this whole process works.